We created rules for a haunted house that shouldn't exist. Now, as adults, we found a house matching its description. Part 10. Together, we walked up the final flight of stairs to the 5th floor. We had not designed a way into the attic, which is one of the reasons I considered our designs unfinished. Years ago, sitting together in our parents' apartments, we had made the notation that the 5th floor puzzle room would take whoever solved the 5th puzzle directly to the attic. The attic was a treasure room as well as an attic, after all, and we had intended to make it very difficult to get there. As I've mentioned, if we thought that we might someday face this house and that making it as difficult as we could back then would somehow help us get our friend Sally back. I don't think we ever stated it aloud as kids. Based on what we'd seen so far as adults, we could only assume that the house would fill in the details as to how we would get from the puzzle room to the attic. Before the puzzle room and the attic, though, there was the rest of the 5th floor that needed crossing. By the time we got up the stairs and were walking through the 5th floor anteroom, Patrick seemed to have gotten better at hobbling on what we were hoping was just a bad ankle sprain. The expressions on his face, though, made me think that the pain was as bad or worse than it had been. In this anteroom there were a series of photorealistic paintings that my mind kept telling me were real blown-up photographs. The frames were gilded and elegant, a stark contrast to the subject matter. These framed pictures were about the doll's head pots with plants in them on the front porch of the house. From left to right on one wall, they showed first a doll head being removed from its body, then it being sawed open with a saw, then filled with an actual brain, then filled the rest of the way with soil. The final two pictures showed a dead or dying plant, something like a small tomato plant without its fruit being transplanted to the doll head pot, and lastly what looked like a dried, shriveled heart being attached to a branch of the dead or dying plant with twine, as if the dried heart were some kind of makeshift fruit. In all of these pictures, the hands of whoever was doing these things was always out of view. That brain and heart, Patrick said. That wasn't our doing. Yeah, Greg said. Not to mention how realistic it is. Guess I was a good enough doodler as a kid, but I couldn't have made anything approaching that level of realism in one of those old sketchbooks. Nobody could. It's like someone really took pictures while putting one of those doll head pots out front together, Jennifer said, and then took some liberties. My mouth had gotten very dry. I had to borrow Patrick's water bottle. Well, I said, Sally did like dolls, and the creepier the better. Similar to other anterooms, I think we had put all this stuff in to prepare who was going through the house for what was beyond. We knew that what was on the 5th floor would be almost entirely Sally. Unlike the other floors, which we kind of shared other than the puzzle room, we'd ended up moving most of her ideas up to the 5th floor, the highest floor next to the attic. After she had disappeared, we had done that to honor her. By the way, the mannequins on a couple of the other floors had been her idea to begin with. She used to say, "What are mannequins but grown-up dolls?" The next room had some of Sally's creepiest doll ideas. Dolls sat on shelves with their heads completely turned around. Dolls were glued together into towers and pyramids. There was decaying furniture so overrun with dilapidated dolls and doll parts that you couldn't tell where the furniture ended and the doll parts began. Doll heads were used as bowls, vases, and light coverings. Doll limbs were arranged on the floor in random, yet strangely esoteric patterns. The next bedroom was like this as well, but there was a human skeleton in that next bedroom. I nearly fell over and took Patrick with me. Greg and I were supporting Patrick and his hurt leg. At that point we were taking shifts. The skull on that skeleton had been replaced by a doll's head. It took us a few moments before we recalled that this had been Sally and Greg's idea. However, any relief we had upon remembering was quickly replaced by even more terror. We had not colored anything in Greg's sketchbooks as kids. Any colors were all the house's doing. By now we understood that it liked to fill in the details, often to dramatic effect. The eyes of the doll head on top of the skeleton were green. The hair was blonde, like Sally's. "It's just messing with us," I said. "Hey, Patrick, your dead weight, as you called it, is already coming in handy. I think I might have wandered a bit after seeing that skeleton if we weren't propping you up." "Yes," Jennifer said. "A trap should be next to that, between that skeleton and the front of the door." Some dolls sailed past us. Twang, thwipipip. My heart seemed like it was halfway out of my ribcage. Sharpened bones had zipped by, missing us by less than a foot. They'd come from an inconspicuous recess in the wall like flying spears. Greg sauntered up next to the other three of us, who were trying to support Patrick and keep our own balance at the same. "You've got to spring every trap you can," Greg said. "Treasure hunting 101 or haunted house traipsing 101. "I'm not really sure. You're crazy," Jennifer said. "Yeah," he said. "Tell me that again when this is done and we're getting ready to leave." Greg had a decent point. Although the other puzzle rooms had secret passages that had led back to the anterooms and stairway after solving the puzzles, this time would probably be a little different because, presumably, we'd be going up to the attic, and then coming down from the attic. If we survived, it looked like Greg had thrown some dolls onto the pressure-plated area for that particular trap. I kept getting mental. Images of somebody else's sharpened bones sticking out of my body. The next room was even worse. By design. The stench of decay hit us as soon as the door was opened. This bedroom was furnished with an opulent nightstand, mirror dresser, and canopy bed with curtains. There was horse riding paraphernalia decorating the walls and shelves. Like an antique riding crop and riding helmet. Sally loved horses. When I used to think about what I hoped had happened to her instead of what probably happened, I would imagine her having run away from the cramped spaces of our apartment complex to become a professional equestrian in some nice, open place. Or maybe she had joined a circus where she did tricks with horses, but she'd had a good family that she would have been running away from. Even though money had been tight for them. Her parents had once paid for all of us to go horseback riding on a ranch together. That had been a whole lot of fun. Scary, but fun. I'd kept thinking I was going to fall off or get thrown from one of those large animals. Our guide had been aloof, but Sally had helped me through it. I think she'd helped all of us through it. That had been when she was 11 and the rest of us were 9 and 10. By the time her 12th birthday had come, she was gone. I went over to other side of the large, elaborate bedroom and tested the other door. Yep, I said. It's locked. We tried to prepare ourselves for what we, mostly Sally and a heaping of Greg, had decided would be in the canopied bed of this room. It was another something we had to face to go farther. We drew aside the curtains. Inside, a unicorn was lying on the bed. Its horn was broken, and a good portion of its face was sloughed off to the bone. Flies and maggots had colonized both its surfaces and exposed interiors. It's okay, Patrick said. He stood up on his own, without two of us propping him up, though I could see him wince from the effort. It's dead. In its mucky mane were objects that had been braided in beaded and jeweled trinkets, symbols made of woven vines, and a silver key on a chain. It was the key that we needed. Somebody just had to reach over and unbraid the chain from the dead creature's hair. Jennifer and Greg had been supporting Patrick at the time, so I took it upon myself. I got a good breath, careful not to breathe through my nose, steeled myself, and figured I would just dive right in, the condition that Maine was in. It seemed the hair might just pull away with the key. A large horse's eye opened. We all got back as the by all appearances rotting unicorn carcass stood up on the bed and clopped down. On the bed where it had lain were pieces of hair and flesh that made an outline of its body. It galloped over to us, backed us into a corner. Its front hooves kept trying to clip us. Its green grime teeth chomped inches from our faces. Its broken horn threatened a slower death than a sharper whole horn could. One of us has got to run, Jennifer said, to distract it, while the others get the key. We can't run, I said. Rule number 4. Wouldn't do to have both the entities and that thing chasing us at the same time. Gonna get ourselves killed if we don't do something, Patrick said. Then Patrick hollered at the unicorn. He couldn't stomp his feet because of his injury, but I think he'd been hoping to frighten it. My stomach sank as it put a hoof in Patrick's chest, and I thought I heard something snap. At that point we'd been letting the wall support Patrick. His body completely buckled to the floor. Patrick, Jennifer said. Patrick was crawling in a semicircle, face down, jerking. I'm gonna gouge that thing's eyes out, Greg said. As if understanding, the unicorn aimed its broken horn at Greg's face, and then charged. Jennifer pulled Greg out of the way. The unicorn thumped the wall like a ram against a tree trunk. Then it walked back and got ready for another charge. The stench was crushing. More flesh, hair, maggots, and other stuff had fallen off of it. One of its eyes did seem about ready to fall out. Maybe if we could keep dodging, its body would fall apart on its own. Or maybe the unicorn would find a way to keep moving until we were dead. But that got me thinking about falling on horses. It jogged loose a more specific memory of Sally. I'd been riding on a horse behind hers on a trail near that ranch. My saddle seemed like it was sliding over, and my body too, and I was sure I was about to fall. The up and down motion was giving me a thrashing at the same time. I'd been trying to shout for help over the sound of hooves. As I alluded to before, our adult guide hadn't been very attentive to us, but Sally had ridden her horse back to me. She got a hold of my reins and was able to slow my horse down. I told her I was afraid and that I did not want to do horse riding anymore. I was ready to go home. She'd said something to the effect of, "This horse doesn't want you to fall. It doesn't want you to get hurt. Relax. Work with it, not against it. Your horse will help you to keep from falling." It comforted me and allowed me to enjoy the rest of that day. Recalling that also helped me remember more details of when Sally had put the unicorn into our designs of this house. She had not wanted to put any horses into it. She had not wanted them to be scary or dangerous. Greg had pushed the issue, though, because he kept emphasizing that the house needed that kind of stuff from her. The more she had said she should never try to make them scary, the more he had insisted. Eventually she had compromised with this unicorn. Not a horse, but a mythical version of the horse. But if this zombie unicorn was true to Sally's wishes, I began to think maybe we weren't approaching it the right way. I got as calm as I could, which was very hard given the situation, and I walked towards the unicorn. The unicorn had been charging again, but it slowed down like I'd actually confused it. Jennifer and Greg were screaming at me. I can't speak for Sally, I told them. while being careful not to turn my back to the unicorn. But maybe she'd say that it doesn't want us to get hurt. It's been hurt, though. We should try to work with it. Slowly. I held out a hand. The unicorn snapped towards it, but it stopped. It sniffed the peace offering. I sighed, knowing how unpleasant it would be without really knowing. And I ran a hand through its decomposing scalp. Hair and less solid stuff came away in my fingers. I worked my way up to the key, and I worked the key loose. Greg and Jennifer were able to help Patrick up, who was breathing heavy and said he felt like somebody had taken a sledgehammer to his chest. All of us approached the unicorn and gave it some careful pettings. Even Patrick, who needed assistance. Seemed like Patrick was already recovering from getting hoofed in the chest. I was thinking to myself, I don't know what kind of diet or workout regimen he's on, but I've got to get on that myself. That guy was holding up quite well, all things considered. Sliding down a long chute into a wall. Getting kicked in the chest by an undead unicorn. Dang. But back to that unicorn. It tried to follow us out of the door when we unlocked the room on the other side. Seemed it was on its way to becoming our very own pet zombie unicorn. Jennifer said that Sally would have been proud of how I handled it. I think that made Greg a little jealous. He didn't say as much, but I could tell. The key wouldn't leave the inside lock after we unlocked it. So we figured we had to abandon the key when we shut the door. When the door locked again behind us, it was a more audible click than for the previous floor. We heard the unicorn pawing the door on the other side. This time it wasn't a hallway but a railway. There was a cart, and there was a tacky plastic ghost dangling above it. You know, the cliché little thing that's like a sheet with two eyes and a round mouth cut into it. A round hat was on its head and a cane was in the folds of what constituted as a hand. A little light on the ghost flashed eerie blue. And an electronic, cheesy, carnival vendor voice said, "Step right up for the ride of your lives. So close, but so far if you're dead. Death can be a long, long journey. I should remind you, please keep your arms, legs, and head on your body, at all times." Then there was ghoulish laughter. Again, more tacky than scary. We knew from our designs, though, that this tackiness was meant to throw the traverser of haunted houses off, to put them at ease and therefore make what came later even scarier and more dangerous. As I've been saying, we had been trying to make it as scary and dangerous as possible when we were kids. And this, after all, was the 5th floor. Only one person could get into that cart at a time. Maybe 2 kids could have fit. But we weren't kids anymore. It wasn't far that the cart had to go on that railway. It was about the same distance as the hallways directly below us. But we knew that it would go slowly. And that if you didn't get in that cart, if you tried to walk it, you probably would not make it very far. The larger blades would swing more quickly and randomly if you didn't get into that cart. That was how we had designed it. Anyway, there were little blades inside the cart itself and larger ones in the grooves of the walls. The ones inside the cart stuck out like a porcupine's quills, forcing you to stand up, while the larger ones swung back and forth like pendulums, forcing you to duck down into the cart. If you ducked or stood up at the wrong time, you might get yourself fouled up pretty bad. The saving grace for the trap was that the blades operated on prime numbers 5 and below 2, 3 and 5. Once you figured out the pattern, you could wait the correct number of seconds. Problem was, it was different each time, so the first person didn't have it any easier or harder than the next. Greg offered to go first. He got cut a little at first through his sock by one of the cart's extending and retracting quills, and that gave us a pretty big fright because he still had a long way to go. But at the end of the railway he got out and shouted back to us that he was alright. I think his pattern had been 2 seconds, then the little cart blades, 5 seconds, then the larger pendulum blades, repeat, or something like that, or that might have been mine. I don't remember. As soon as Greg jumped out, the cart started coming back. Jennifer went through with some near misses but without getting cut. I still think that on most days she's got the best balance and agility out of the 4 of us by far. I waited for Patrick to go because I wanted to watch from behind, in case I could help from that angle in some way. We were most worried about him. Oddly, it was like getting knocked around woke something up in Patrick, because he seemed to do the best of us then, even with a sprained ankle and what we hoped was just a bruised chest. It wasn't pretty, though. Patrick shouted about every time he stood up and was grunting in between. When I saw him afterwards, he was all snotty-nosed, bleary-eyed, and drenched in sweat. As for me, I got cut a little in the beginning like Greg did. It was those quills in the cart that got me just like they got Greg, through my jeans and into the side of my calf as I was trying to stand. It probably would have been a whole lot worse if I'd been wearing shorts, after those first cart blades disappeared. Though, I was able to duck down and count and learn the seconds for the pendulum blade. And then I had a pretty good idea of my sequence. When I got through it, when all of us were through, we glanced over each other's scrapes, finding Greg and mine to be nothing worthy of stitches. We stopped to celebrate. We gave ourselves a few cheers. Figured we deserved it. Patrick joked I hoped he was joking that he might keel over and die later from internal injuries, but that he'd do all in his power to put that on hold until after we'd gotten the treasure. The house had thrown nearly everything at us, and so far we'd survived. We'd risked our lives. We felt that we could do it a few more times if we had to. We felt that we were readier than ever to see it through to the end. But the room after the railway, the final puzzle room, baffled us more than any other had. It baffled us through its simplicity. It was a bright room. White walls, white ceiling and floor tiles. There was a medium-sized, round wooden table at the center of the room, where the puzzle should be. On top of the table was a little wooden tray with a slanted receptacle or nook. There was a silver key in the nook, and there was a wire running behind it and into the wall. We were as thorough as always, searching every inch to and crevice of that puzzle room, which was about the size of the 4th and 3rd floor puzzle rooms. Here are the only clues we could see in the 5th floor puzzle room. A medium-sized round wooden table in the center of the room, where the puzzle should be. On top of this table, there was a wooden tray with a slanted receptacle, kind of like a pocket or nook. Upon closer inspection, we found the receptacle to be about 3 inches wide and about 7 inches deep. A silver key that seemed to be lodged into the bottom of the inside of the tray's nook or receptacle. We had some concerns that removing this key would start the puzzle. A wire running from the receptacle tray's backside and into the wall opposite the room's entrance. A part of the wiring was frayed, almost broken, nearest the back wall. The floors, wall, and ceiling of the room were all white. Combined with the brightness of the room's lighting, it made us feel as if it were difficult to tell exactly where the walls were. Those were all the clues. We were having trouble, not just because of how little there was in that room to go on, but because Sally wasn't there with us. This had to be Sally's puzzle. But what did any of this have to do with her? We racked our brains. The only thing I could think of that might relate Sally to the stuff in this room was about puzzles in general. Just like the haunted house had been Sally's idea to begin with. Having puzzles in our haunted house had been Sally's idea, too, hadn't it? And hadn't Sally said something about how puzzles, when it really came down to it, were nothing more or less than a collection of rules? About how once you discovered the secret of those rules you'd solve the puzzle. Jennifer and Patrick felt I might be onto something. Greg wasn't so sure Sally had said those things. I was reminded again of that song in the 2nd floor anteroom, played to us from an old gramophone, about how memory isn't as sure as destiny. Despite how minimalist that room and its puzzle at first seemed to be, we spent a long time in there figuratively banging our heads against those bright walls, that silver key in the nook on the table, the white walls, the brightness of the room, the wire running from the nook's platform and into the wall. What did any of that have to do with Sally? We had a breakthrough when Jennifer made a certain observation, almost casually. It was one that did not seem to relate very much at first to the items in the puzzle room. It related more to what I'd brought up earlier about Sally coming up with the idea of puzzles being on each floor. Jennifer pointed out that all of the other puzzles had to do with rules. While it seemed to be the case that each puzzle was most connected to one of us, every puzzle also seemed like it was trying to get us to break one rule in particular as well. For the 1st floor puzzle, Jennifer said, which was related to me, we had to resist grabbing the treasure, which according to the 7th rule should be in the attic. Yeah, Patrick said, that's right. And with the puzzle that related to me on the 2nd floor, we had to get around that rule about climbing stairs. They looked at me. The one most related to me, I said, that would be the 3rd floor puzzle. The 5th rule is about failing and solving the floor puzzles. We had to fail that one in order to succeed. Well, let's see. Greg said, my puzzle on the 4th floor nearly got us to violate the 4th rule. About running. Huh, that's weird. 4th floor puzzle. 4th rule. That is weird, Jennifer said. I'm guessing the house did that intentionally. 7th, 6th, 5th, and 4th rules. The rules are going in reverse. By now Jennifer was speaking a lot less casually. If there's a pattern here, the next puzzle should not only be about Sally, but also about the 3rd rule, the one about depositing electronics in that cubbyhole near the house's entrance. Patrick stood up where he had been sitting. He had to steady himself against one of those white walls that made the room feel much larger than it was. He winced as he took some pressure off his bad ankle. He pointed. That wooden thing on the table, he said, with a wire running from it into the wall. That thing looks like it could be a charging station, doesn't it? We all stared at it for a moment. You know what? Jennifer said. You could be right. I think it's the silver key in there that's throwing us off. I said. If that's what it is, a charging station, or something that can plug into one of our phones. We talked about it a bit. There was no way for us to know if it was a charging station without removing the silver key lodged into the bottom of its nook. If there was some kind of apparatus that plugged into a phone down there, it might have been under where the key was lodged. Then I remembered and brought up the key that had been braided into that rotting unicorn's mane. That key had been silver, too, hadn't it? It had unlocked the unicorn's bedroom that we had been trapped inside with that creature. The room had locked behind us when we left. Maybe this silver key was meant to unlock it again, so that we could go back through that bedroom, go downstairs, and get a cell phone. That made us a little more confident to remove the key, something we'd been reluctant to do for fear of triggering the puzzle before we were ready. That still left the question of how to get around breaking the rule about electronics. Maybe we should break the electronic phone. Patrick said. That could be what the frayed wire is telling us. So we go downstairs, get a phone, and break it apart. Then we put it back together here and plug it in. Maybe we don't even need to break it. It could be as simple as taking out the battery. You really think that would work? Greg said. Does removing the battery or some other part from an electronic device, so that it no longer functions, make it no longer an electronic device? That gave us some pause. Then I remembered something else. Probably wouldn't matter, I said. You'd have to break another rule anyway. Remember that rule about solving each floor puzzle? In addition to what it says about succeeding and failing the puzzle, there's also something in there about not fleeing the puzzle. The entities might come after us anyway as soon as we leave the area. But didn't we leave the second floor puzzle room? Jennifer said. To look again at some of the other rooms in the hallway on the second floor. Maybe it's considered fleeing once you leave the entire floor. Patrick said. Or once you leave the house. Greg said. Regardless, I said. We can't stay in here forever. I don't know about you guys, but swinging on a rope upside down, getting my hand burned, climbing and sliding in fear and everything else has got me bushed. Patrick's no doubt feeling worse than I am. I think adrenaline has been propping us all up. Don't know how long that's gonna last. I think one of us should go ahead down and get a cell phone. While we've still some energy in our tanks, I volunteer myself. We should discuss it, Greg said, about who should go downstairs. If that's what we're going to do. Out of the four of us, I said. I might be the person with that unicorn. It would have been Sally, but she's not here. You're worried about it attacking us again when we go back through. Patrick said. It's not that, I said. I did my best to smile. I'm thinking about writing it. Naturally, my friends protested. Something along the lines of I must have a death wish. But I reasoned with them about how that unicorn could help us. As long as I wasn't running myself. The entities should only walk when they tried to get me after I left the puzzle area for the cell phone. That's what I would be counting on. Anyway, I also wanted to see if I could count on that unicorn carrying me faster than I could walk. There was nothing in the rules about riding a horse, or a unicorn, at running speed. I'm more or less won them over about the idea, though we had to take a vote. Greg voted against it. The majority ruled in favor, after we had what we hoped was a working solution to the final puzzle. A puzzle that had gotten us thinking about the other puzzles in the house and how the rules applied to them. I got myself ready mentally. Or tried to. The others patted me on the back, gave me the whole you got this spiel. Even Greg was warming up to the idea and cracking jokes about virgins and unicorns. I figured I might not have this, but at any rate at least I'd go down with a bang, riding the back of a zombie unicorn until I was yanked off by the entities. The others got ready, too, in case I had to hurl the cell phone the final distance through the railway. If I didn't put the cell phone in the cart, they'd have to quickly put it down in the nook, where we hoped there was something it could attach to where the key was lodged. The plan was to take out the battery right after. If that failed to get the entities off our backs, they'd take apart more of the phone, or just try to break it, like we had before entering that house and before starting some of the puzzles. We did our whole counting thing, eyes open this time. Then I pulled the key out. It didn't take long for someone to fish down into the bottom of the nook. There was a small hole where the key had been lodged. Inside it was a wire lead. It didn't look like any kind of wire head we were used to, though. Tiny symbols were engraved in the metal prong. You had to get really close to make them out. Gold spiraling out of a treasure chest, a stairway, and more. Each symbol seemed to represent one of our previous puzzles. It may not have looked like something that would ordinarily be plugged into a cell phone, but it seemed the right size, and that along with those symbols made us more confident in the plan. Pocketing the silver key, I nodded to the others. Then I headed out of the room as quickly as I could without running. We still didn't know whether the puzzles were timed once started. Thankfully, the blade traps didn't active when I took the railway cart back. It wasn't something I could relax about yet, though, because I thought I'd probably have to face them again when returning to the puzzle room. The other silver key worked. It unlocked the unicorn's bedroom door. When I went in, the unicorn was waiting for me a few feet from the entryway. Like it had heard me coming back. I tried not to pay attention to the maggots, rotting flesh, and exposed inner parts. I also tried not to think about the unicorn pulverizing me with its hooves or that broken horn it had. Well, hello again, Unitorn, I said. Alright if I call you Unitorn, you know, torn instead of corn because of how your body's all torn up. Get it? It stared at me with its huge, dark eyes. One of those eyes bulged and sagged slightly more than the other. Its broken horn was lowered, but I hoped that was more in pacification than intent to strike. How about, Pete, I said. Maybe that's a little better. Pete the unicorn. Pete, if you help us by giving me a little ride up and down the stairs, we'll do all we can to get you out of this house. I promise. Sound like a deal? It neighed, shaking off jiggling white maggots and pieces of hair and flesh. Okay, I said. Maybe that means you understand. Or maybe that was a coincidence. Either way, I'm going to try to get on you in a moment. Please don't kill me. I approached the creature and gave it some pats, which it tolerated. There may have been a saddle somewhere in that opulent bedroom, in one of the many fancy drawers of the nightstand or mirror dresser. For example, there might have been one in the closet. I did not spend time searching for a saddle. However, because I didn't know how much time we had after removing that key and because I wasn't sure how to properly saddle a horse or unicorn to begin with, I also remembered something Sally had told me when we were kids, something about riding a horse without a saddle. She'd said it was possible, it was just harder. You had to really get a good grip on the horse's mane. I was hoping, with the state that unicorn was in, that its mane would not completely pull away as I was riding. My hand on the unicorn's cold, damp back. I got ready to leap up onto it. I had no idea how successful I'd be without using a stirrup for my feet. I figured I'd have to do some climbing, but as I was tensing to jump, the unicorn, surprisingly enough, knelt down for me, thanking Pete the unicorn. While being bewildered he had done that, I climbed on. Then he stood again. I gripped his mane. I could tell that some of the hairs were better attached than others. In any case, when I tried to get the unicorn to turn, I leaned with my body and used the grip of my legs rather than pulling on the mane. I'm not sure if that's the way you're supposed to do it, but like I said, I was worried about the rest of its hair coming out. That unicorn was a rotting carcass. After all, as quickly as I could, I got a basic idea of how to use the pressure of my legs to ask the unicorn to change its speed. Some of that was remembering the horse riding we'd done with Sally years ago. It was strange how the unicorn responded as well as a trained horse would, despite the unicorn working with me. Already I was experiencing some pain while riding it, and it seemed like its bones were jabbing into me much more than a normal horse's would. I wondered if it could feel pain, too. Like the dead or dying plants on the front porch. I figured it had never been alive to begin with. Either way, I had no wish to cause it any more harm than what it might already be suffering by simply existing. Pete the unicorn and I had to get downstairs. We had to grab the cell phone and come back up, without getting nabbed by the entities. I wasn't sure whether they would harm the unicorn. For that matter, I couldn't be sure if it would try to work with them and give me over to them as soon as they appeared. Speaking of the entities, they hadn't come after me yet, so maybe fleeing the puzzle was related to the floor or related to the entire house. I rode the unicorn over to the other of its bedroom doors, the one that didn't need a key. I leaned down and opened it. As I rode Pete into the first of the doll bedrooms, I was thankful that Greg had decided to spring that trap here earlier. I nevertheless kept our distance from that skeleton with that doll's head that had some of Sally's features. It was not long after we got to the stairs that the entities made an appearance. They were near the bottom, and some of them were already on their way up. The smaller bodies where heads should be gazed up at me from where they reclined. I had something like an epiphany of dread, of how those things might run despite the crooked limbs and the robes of the larger bodies. The smaller bodies fused to the top of them seemed much more efficiently structured and muscled. If they could somehow detach themselves from the larger bodies, they might move very fast, even faster than a person could. Maybe they would detach themselves once you started running. I didn't want to find out, but I had to risk galloping the unicorn to see if it fell under the same rules as us. There was no way I alone could dodge all of those entities with their 6 or 7, while navigating the stairs at the same time. Here we go, Pete, I said. We've got to run past those things coming up the stairs. We've got to get to the front door. I tried to use the pressure of my legs, as well as a hiya, for dramatic effect. The undead unicorn rocketed forward. My head snapped back. My hands, which had been shaking, nearly lost their grip. Pete went down the stairs so quickly that I barely had time to react to what was happening. On the 3rd floor landing, a large, many-fingered hand reached out from the side. It nearly snatched me off Pete's back. I guess one entity had already been on the 3rd floor landing, waiting for us. Most of the others were coming upstairs with their strange, methodical, dance-like rhythm. Neither they nor the smaller bodies fused to the top of them were running. That was a relief. I didn't see Walt when I glanced above, though I hadn't broken the rule about going upstairs before solving a puzzle. I was pretty sure Walt the stairman was up there somewhere watching, wedged crazily into the top of the stairway with his crooked limbs. Walt's brethren were threat enough. I felt a scream rising in my throat as I realized that there wasn't enough room to get around the entities on the stairs. We had to go through them. I wasn't sure what they were made of. I wasn't sure how strong they were. If it came down to playing chicken, I didn't know which side would be the larger car. But that unicorn skipped the last flight of stairs entirely. It leapt over the railing. I braced myself for impact. When we slammed down on the 1st floor, my teeth clacked together in my mouth. I tasted blood. I've got a chipped tooth from that incident. But at the time I was just thankful we'd made it beyond the entities. And I was more concerned that the impact would have devastating consequences for that rotting unicorn carcass I was riding. Pete held up though. I'm pretty sure he lost some of his mass, but he held up. Pete trotted up to the front door. I leaned from the unicorn's back wishing again I'd had the time and know how to search for and put on a saddle. And I reached as far as I could into the cubbyhole, until I got my hand on a cell phone. I turned the unicorn around to find an entity just a few feet away. Its smaller body had completely unfurled on the mound where the larger body's head should be. The smaller body unveiled those blade-covered upper arms. Because the entities had only been walking upstairs, it made them closer to me now than if they had been running. The ones that had been in the rear of that procession were especially close. I figured Pete couldn't pull the same magic twice, not while going upstairs. I figured we'd have to clear those entities from the stairway. So I tried leading them away by going away from the stairs. I rode Pete throughout the rooms of the first floor. They did follow, but they did something weird. They all got into the parlor, the room next to the foyer and stairs, and would not move beyond it. It was the room with that clown etched into the top of a cabinet and the Mona Lisa George Washington melted face portrait that had holes for eyes. The 6 or 7 entities gathered there. I have trouble remembering even how many gathered in that parlor. Maybe it had something to do with the distortion of air around them. Like foggy glass in a mirror. At the edges of the room, they did an obscene little dance with their crooked limbs. The smaller bodies on top of them joined in. It was as if a group of psychotic cultists combined the random stuff you see in a modern dance club with some kind of ceremonial waltz. And then added a dash of their own esoteric flair, reverent and irreverent at the same time. The crooked limbs of their larger bodies and the handless, bladed arms of their upper bodies didn't help make it any less unpleasant. At the culmination of that strange dance, they all turned in my direction, and waited. I was outside of the parlor at this point, looking in from the kitchen. What could I do but ride the unicorn at a gallop through the ring of them? That's what I did. I had to get back to my friends. If I'd been part of some ritual those entities had been doing in the parlor, I didn't want to think about it. I galloped Pete up the stairs and to his bedroom. I gave him some pettings, assured him again that we'd try our best to get him out. The entities, for all I could tell, had no longer been chasing me. That weird dance of theirs had signaled the end of their pursuit after I'd broken a couple of rules. I had no idea what it meant, but it did seem to tell me a couple of things. One of which, they probably weren't dumb enough to have been led by me from the stairs without them realizing what I was doing. The other, they had their own motives, beyond the rules we'd made, that were foreign to me, probably foreign to all of us. Had we created them, or had they been created by the house that we created? The entities themselves were one of those things, like the finer details of many of the house's objects and like the puzzles that we had left vague, like the house had seemed to have done when it filled in those details. I suppose the house was filling in the details about the entities, but if the house had done so, it was almost like it had created something of its own. I thought maybe the house was making some kind of play at symbolism. The entities had those larger bodies with the smaller ones fused on, like adulthood fused to childhood or vice versa. I had no idea what it might be trying to accomplish in that, or what the house or the entities could want beyond scaring and hurting whoever went inside. Those were 2 motives we had worked into the house's designs when we were children. Having left the unicorn behind in that bedroom, I went through the cart with the quills and the pendulum blades again. I was feeling alone at first. Soon, though, I heard my friends beyond the railway, after nearly getting my head sliced through by one of those pendulums, and then nearly getting hit again by some of those quills. I figured out the prime number sequence for my second trip in the cart. Even with some near misses, I got out without a scratch the second time. The blood from that cut on my leg from the first time was still wet, a reminder of what could have happened or worse. My friends greeted me on the other side. I told them Pete the unicorn. Yes, we're calling him Pete now. No, he seems to like that name. Had done admirably, as well any unicorn from myth might do. They asked me where the entities were. I told them about that ritualistic jig the entities had done in the parlor after I'd gotten the cell phone and had tried to lead them away from the stairs. A real hoedown. That, my friends weren't amused. They kept looking past me, over their shoulders, up at the ceiling, in the corners of the hall and puzzle room everywhere as if the entities might ambush us at any moment. Maybe breaking 2 rules cancels those rules out. Patrick said, I don't think it's that simple. Greg said, it would be in the rules if it was that way. We didn't have much time to talk about it. We didn't know how much time we had after removing the silver key from the nook on the table. I went over and pulled up the wire lead and plugged it into the cell phone. I think it was Jennifer's cell phone, though I'm not certain if that really matters. The bright lights of the room flickered before going completely out. I think I had expected a little wooden attic stairway or something to snap free of the ceiling. You know, a typical way for people to access an attic. But when those bright lights shut completely off, a door slid across the entryway and put us in pitch blackness. Needless to say, it was a big contrast to the lighting earlier. Then the entire room began to move, like an elevator, except I didn't know if it was going up, down, left, or right. We didn't say anything, but all of us got closer to each other. And, just as wordlessly, we all got back to back. We tensed up. I don't know who had started it first or if we had all started getting into that defensive arrangement at once. It reminded me, in a way, of the unstated reason why we had been trying to finish the haunted house as kids after Sally was gone. Without saying as much, we had all thought it might help bring her back. If we had to deal with something else that the house threw at us here or in the attic, something we had not designed but that the house was filling in the details for, whatever it was would have to deal with the four of us. The fifth floor puzzle had been solved. As that entire puzzle room moved, we readied ourselves in darkness and silence, carrying the unspoken bonds of our childhood friendship as a light. The attic and the treasure had to be next.